Hey, hope your internet's going well. Let's talk about Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 is a first-person shooter developed by Valve and sequel to Half-Life released in November of 2004. Now, to say that Half-Life 2 was a highly anticipated game would be a gross understatement. Half-Life was one of the most revolutionary games ever made thanks to its interactive gameplay and fundamental difference in FPS storytelling at the time. That game set the standard for basically every first-person game going forward, so it's safe to say that the sequel had a lot of very high expectations to meet if it wanted to even come close to the original. Let's see how they did. We'll start with the presentation first. Half-Life 2 is powered by what Valve calls the Source Engine. Now, Half-Life 1 was a decent-looking game when it came out, but I wouldn't say that it was one of its strongest aspects. Its art direction was solid, but environments were extremely flat, and most of its locations left a lot to be desired. There also just wasn't many unique locations to begin with. It was serviceable at the time, but Half-Life 1's visuals really start to show their age these days. Half-Life 2, on the other hand, is an excellent looking game, even by today's standards. It looks drastically better than the original did, so much so that it is shocking going from one to the other. Obviously stuff like lighting and textures look better, but it's the level of detail that really has the most noticeable upgrade. Every environment in this game is just packed with so many little objects and things to look at. Then there's the location variety, which is also a huge upgrade over Half-Life 1. Aside from there just being more locations overall, they all have a unique atmosphere. Some of my favorites include Ravenholm, which is this abandoned mining town infested with zombies and other enemies, and Bridgepoint, which as the name suggests, is a massive bridge that you need to cross. It's not just the visuals that make Half-Life 2's presentation so great though, it's also the music. Half-Life 1's music composer, Kelly Bailey, returned for Half-Life 2 and created another great soundtrack to go with these levels. So yeah, Half-Life 2 looks and sounds great. Let's talk about the gameplay next. Half-Life 2's gameplay is also quite a big step up from its predecessor. The fundamentals that made the original so great are all still here, like its fast-paced tactical combat and its environmental interactivity. But Half-Life 2 has one key thing that sets itself apart. This is the gravity gun, Half-Life 2's most defining feature. It's a tool that you acquire very early in the game that allows you to pick up pretty much anything you want. Physics were occasionally used in some games before this, including Half-Life 1, but never to this extent. A lot of this game's core design revolves around this mechanic. It allows you to stack things on top of each other in order to reach places that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. It also allows you to pick up objects and turn them into a projectile against your enemies, and so much more. The physics in this game allow for things that simply weren't possible before. It creates this really interesting dynamic of constantly trying to push the boundaries of what the physics can handle as you experiment with different outcomes. And it's not just the gravity gun that allows you to interact with the environment. Half-Life 2 has more things to do outside of combat than the first game did. For example, there's a couple vehicle segments where you control either a scout car or a mud skipper. And later on, you'll need to take control of a crane in order to reposition your vehicle to progress. There's just so much more diversity in the gameplay here than before. The levels are constantly changing it up to keep things interesting. As far as combat goes, it's not much different than the first game when you take the gravity gun out of the equation, which I'm fine with. Most of the original weapons return with updated looks, but handle pretty much identical to how they did before. Before we move on to the story, I do have a few minor complaints about the gameplay. For one, I think some of the levels go on for quite a bit longer than they need to, specifically the vehicle ones. These levels are great when you first start them, but they get old pretty quick after the novelty wears off and it starts to feel like padding, especially the mud skipper one. And then there's the AI. The enemy AI in this game is great for its time. They do things that you typically aren't expecting in a way that usually feels fair. But then there's the AI for your allies, which is comically bad. Towards the end, you often have sections where there's like 5 or 6 people following you around, and these guys just love to get in your way and get stuck on anything and everything. It's especially bad indoors when they all just kind of clamp up together and block your way forward. Or sometimes you'll be in the middle of a large gunfight and you'll look around and see them just standing around getting shot at, which is kind of funny but also ruins the immersion. My last major complaint has to do with the way that Half-Life 2 handles its difficulty. I always play this on the normal difficulty because I feel like that should be the way that the developers intended. The first 70 or maybe even 80% of this game I would say is extremely easy, even if you're not very good at FPS games. The enemies don't do much damage to you at all, and there's very rarely any areas that will give you a hard time. But then, for whatever reason, in the last few chapters, the difficulty just spikes out of nowhere. There's these large enemies called Striders that you need to shoot rockets at to take out, but these things just melt your health in a matter of seconds. Like, I know you shouldn't be able to just stand out in the open in front of them, but these enemies feel extremely overtuned. And then I feel like the combat designers just got a bit lazy in the last few chapters, because they seem to resort to just sending in huge hordes of enemies at you, instead of the more strategic placement that you're used to up to that point. Now, none of these issues are a big deal, but I do feel like they were worth mentioning. Alright, let's go over the story next.
Rise and shine, Mr. Freeman. Rise and shine.
So while Half-Life 2's gameplay is a clear evolution of its predecessor, its story is quite a bit different. It takes place around 20 or so years after the events of the first game. Once again taking control of Gordon Freeman, you begin in a place called City 17. You soon realize that the city, as well as the rest of Earth, is under the control of a new enemy type called the Combine. Now, without going super deep into the lore, the Combine are basically an intergalactic species whose primary goal is to take over and control as many other species as possible. Quite a different introduction compared to Half-Life 1. In that game, everything was explained to you very quickly through on-screen text, but Half-Life 2 leaves you with more questions than answers after the first chapter. You'll eventually meet up with someone named Alex Vance, as well as several returning characters from Half-Life 1. Alex is essentially your partner/guide that joins you on several missions throughout the campaign. She explains new mechanics to you like the gravity gun, as well as fills you in on important story information. This brings me to my first major criticism about how Half-Life 2 handles its story. This game relies really hard on forced exposition in order to progress the narrative. And I don't mean forced exposition in the sense that all of the dialogue is bad or boring. I mean it in the way that the dialogue is delivered to you. You are interrupted very often in between levels with some kind of progression halting sequence so that a character can explain the current situation to you. It usually involves you being locked in a room with one or more people so that they can fill you in on what's going on. This might not bother some people, but I really dislike when a game does this. Now, it's not that I don't think that this should ever happen. Certain plot points require exposition, and they serve as a nice pace breaker in between the combat and all the other stuff that you do in this game. But stopping you and locking you in a room just for a couple minutes of dialogue is super unnecessary and could have been handled in a much better way. Anyway, after you meet Alex and your old friends, a plan is formed to teleport you and her to someone named Eli, Alex's father. This plan soon fails, because of course it does, and your new objective is to reunite with Alex and her father. This isn't the main goal of the whole game, though. After you regroup with Alex and Eli, the new focus becomes all about fighting back against the Combine. What follows is some of the best chapters in Half-Life 2 as you make your way towards the Citadel, which serves as the Columbine's base of operation. So that's Half-Life 2's story in a nutshell, without spoiling too many things, of course. It's definitely way more of a focus here compared to how it was in the first game, which works for the most part, but does unfortunately cut into the gameplay a bit more than I would like. After you make your way to the top of the Citadel, you're greeted with both the end credits and a pretty epic cliffhanger scene. That brings me to Half-Life 2's expansions. In June of 2006, an official expansion for Half-Life 2 was released, called Half-Life 2 Episode 1. Unlike the expansions for Half-Life 1, which saw you playing as completely different characters, Half-Life 2's expansions instead act as direct sequels to the base game. Story-wise, this takes place immediately after the events of Half-Life 2. You're once again with Alex, and you must find a way back inside the Citadel before the core inside it explodes. You're actually with Alex almost the entire time during this DLC, so the developers use it as an excuse to further hers and Gordon's relationship. The gameplay is also shaken up a fair bit here as well. You actually don't get a real weapon for nearly the first half of this, and instead need to rely on both Alex for protection, as well as your gravity gun. During this time, you'll also be introduced to a couple of new mechanics. The first one involves using your gravity gun to shoot these orbs into a specific location in order to open the path forward. This is a pretty nice addition. It shows off the impressive physics of the Source engine a bit more, and it's also just fun to do. The second is these things called roller mines, which are basically RC bots that you'll need to use in order to take out enemies a few different times. Anyway, after you get through the first half, which has been primarily puzzle solving, you finally get access to some normal weapons. From here on out, it's more Half-Life 2, which is a good thing. This expansion isn't very long, coming in at around 1.5 to 2 hours, depending on the difficulty you choose. For comparison, the base game's campaign should take most people around 10 hours, give or take. It's a great expansion, and I recommend it to anyone that likes Half-Life 2. But this expansion is just a warm-up compared to what comes next. In October of 2007, the second and final expansion for Half-Life 2 was released, in the form of Half-Life 2 Episode 2. Like Episode 1, this expansion picks up right where the story left off. Again controlling Gordon with Alex by your side, you realize that the destruction of the Citadel Tower has left a massive portal in the sky. The fear is that the Combine can use this portal to begin an even larger invasion against Earth, even compared to what was present in Half-Life 2's base campaign. Fortunately, during Chapter 1, Alex acquired something called the Transmission Packet, which is a device that contains the data necessary to shut down this portal. Gordon and Alex must now make it to a place called White Forest so that they can use this device to close the portal, ultimately saving humanity. So yeah, story-wise, there's quite a lot on the line here. What follows is an incredibly interesting string of events that sees Alex and Gordon moving from location to location in order to reach White Forest. One of the more interesting events involves Alex being critically injured and you needing to work with the Vortigons to save her. Gameplay-wise, there isn't a whole lot new here compared to what was already established. There's some new set pieces like this part where you need to hold out against a swarm of antlions in this tunnel using these turrets, and a few more moments I won't spoil. I think this DLC also has too many vehicle segments that, like the base game, go on for way longer than they need to. But aside from that minor criticism, Episode 2 is an excellent expansion for Half-Life 2 that continues to build upon what made the base game and first episode so great. Unfortunately though, this episode ends on one of the most infamous cliffhangers of any video game, and it remains like that to this day. There was originally meant to be a third episode, but it was cancelled for, quote, a lack of direction and the limitations of the episodic format. Valve would eventually release Half-Life Alyx, which is a prequel to Half-Life 2, but never any kind of sequel. To this day, Half-Life 3 remains one of the most anticipated games of all time, and honestly, who knows if it will ever happen. Valve is a weird company that is impossible to predict, so it could happen eventually, or it might not. We'll just have to wait and see. And that's Half-Life 2. While it has a few issues here and there, this is still undoubtedly one of the greatest first-person shooters ever made, and a very worthy sequel to Half-Life. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.